Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on unlocking best practices about the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards and the Mental Capacity Act. The event is led by the National Care Forum as a partner in the Care Providers Alliance and funded by Skills for Care, so thanks to them. And we'll be revisiting DoLS in the context of the Mental Capacity Act, human rights and the indefinite postponement of the liberty protection safeguards that were intended to replace DoLS. My name is Toby Williamson and I'll be chairing and facilitating today's event, together with Liz Jones, who is the Policy Director at the National Care Forum, who I'm going to hand over to now to say some words of welcome on behalf of the National Care Forum. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks, Toby, and good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you. Thanks to so many people for coming to join us today. I'm Liz. I work at the National Care Forum. We're a membership organisation for not-for-profit providers of care and support. Today, the session that we're about to run really has been born out of some work that we did as part of the Care Provider Alliance quite a few years ago, actually. So the Care Provider Alliance is an umbrella grouping of the different trade bodies across social care. Back in the day, when we were working quite closely with the government on the development of the Liberty Protection Safeguards policy, we'd lobbied quite hard for a real focus on what that meant for the adult social care sector, because there was a lot of focus on what it might mean in health and what it might mean in local authorities, but we were trying to strengthen the voice of and support for the care provider sector. As things evolved, and we'll talk more about that, clearly we're now at the place where the liberty protection safeguards have been postponed, but actually the work that was done to get ready for the introduction of that potentially very significant policy change had some real value. And so when we were talking to Skills for Care, who had initially provided some funding to help us support the sector, we thought we would try and make the best of both worlds, really, and take the learning that colleagues across a range of organisations had developed in relation to how liberty protection safeguards would work and what we needed to know, as well as understand the really important things that we're going to talk about today, about what does best practice look like in the current arrangements under the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards and the Mental Capacity Act. So this is the kind of culmination of two quite big bits of work, and I'm really pleased that we've got a fantastic lineup today to help us think about our current DoLS processes and how we can use them to best effect in the interests of the people we support and their families. So thank you, Toby, for chairing. I'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A and helping our speakers make sure we try and answer your questions. Really keen to get your questions, so feel free to put them as you're listening. Certainly I need to put my thoughts down as I'm reacting to what people say. We will endeavour to answer them as we go through, but if not, we'll look at the kind of key themes that are coming out as well. So thank you, everybody. I'll hand back to you, Toby.
Great, thank you, Liz, for that introduction. I'll say a little bit more about today's webinar and subsequent webinars in this series in a minute, but I'll just say a couple of words about myself so you know where I'm coming from. As it says on the screen there, I'm an independent health and social care consultant. I work in the areas of adult and older people's mental health, dementia and mental capacity. in the past, I've worked in frontline services, community and residential, working with people with severe and enduring mental health problems, although that was many years before the Mental Capacity Act came into effect. But for a number of years, I worked at a national charity called the Mental Health Foundation, which some of you may have heard of, a social research and development charity, where I led its work around adult mental health, dementia and mental capacity. And whilst I was there, I co-chaired something called the Making Decisions Alliance, which was a coalition of national charities that successfully campaigned in support of the introduction of the Mental Capacity Act back in 2005. And for my sins, I then worked for a short period of time in the Ministry of Justice, helping with the implementation of the Mental Capacity Act, and then subsequently was involved in pieces of research, training, service development around mental capacity issues, including deprivation of liberty safeguards. And as Liz says, although there's this hiatus currently with the liberty protection safeguards, which seems to be somewhat indefinite, the work that was done in preparation for the introduction of LPS, as they're known, seemed to be really beneficial and important and useful in terms of enabling people to refresh their knowledge of what deprivation of liberties meant in the context of mental capacity and the Mental Capacity Act, and therefore it felt very timely to have these webinars in order to refresh your understanding and knowledge, and to hear about some of the resources and guidance that was developed in preparation for LPS, much of which is still very relevant, and we'll be hearing about that today and in subsequent webinars. So there are two more webinars after this one, on the 7th of November and 5th of December, which will take more of an interactive workshop format and look in depth at ways of avoiding a deprivation of liberty through good care practice and person-centred care. That's on the 7th of November. And then look at current DoLS processes, authorisations and reviews and so on the 5th of December. So I would really encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to sign up for those. I can see we've got a good number of people already here, so I hope you'll join us on those days as well. Just a few words about housekeeping and how you can interact with the webinar today. We have a question and answer function, which you should be able to see on your screen on the tabs, and Liz will be monitoring and moderating that Q&A function. So if things run to time with the speakers, we hope to have a brief break after each speaker, just to take maybe one or possibly two questions for them in particular. But there'll also be time for questions after all the speakers have presented, before we finish the session. Now, if you see a question that's been posed that is similar to one you were thinking of posing, please do, you can like it rather than adding another question. And the number of likes shows us that this is a topic that colleagues really want to hear about. So I would encourage you to do that. We would also encourage you to include your name when posting a question, but you do have the option of posting it anonymously if you prefer. We are recording the session, as you may have noticed. The recording and slides will be made available to all of you after the session via the Care Providers Alliance website. But please note the website will be down and unavailable this coming weekend, just the weekend. So if you're looking for it, you may have to wait until next week. And if you do need live captioning, I believe you can select captions and subtitles on your video controls as well. And please do feel free to use social media, tweeting, etc. during the event to say what you think of it. We'll be doing some of that. We want to encourage people to think about these issues, to hear about the events, and hopefully come to the webinars in November and December as well. So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to the speakers, and since we're running ahead of time, let's go straight to the speakers. So I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Lorraine Curry, who's an independent mental capacity consultant and works on behalf of the West Midlands Association of Directors of Adult Social Services. I've heard Lorraine speak on a number of occasions, and I always think of you, Lorraine, as a kind of go-to expert in terms of what's currently going on with DoLS, particularly from a local authority and social work perspective. So you're going to give us that perspective, I trust, so I know you will, for the next 15 minutes around what is happening with DoLS currently. So straight over to you, Lorraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully now everybody can see my screen. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about deprivation of liberty safeguards. So my current role is with ADAS in the West Midlands. It's as an associate member, looking at all things to do with DoLS and MCA. I have often been called the Mary Berry of DoLS, and I don't know whether that's a compliment or not, but it's quite nice. So I also do things to do with the Mental Capacity Act. I have a kind of wider role as freelance trainer and things that spread out from DoLS, really, that are a little bit wider than just DoLS itself. Okay, if I can make the slides move. So what I'm going to do in 15 minutes, which is no mean feat, I'm going to go sort of back to the beginning and then forwards to the current day, really. So I'm going to just remind us very briefly of where this all began and how it all began to some extent with a man called Harry, who was in Bournemouth Hospital, and how he was kept in Bournemouth Hospital, wasn't allowed to leave with his carers when they came for him, and the Mental Health Act was not used to keep him in Bournemouth Hospital. And arising from that, a whole series of court hearings and so on and so forth came about, basically because of the right that we all have in Article 5 to liberty and security of person. And the Human Rights Act tells us that no one can be deprived of liberty unless they fit into certain cases, and even then, it must be in accordance with a procedure prescribed by law. So at the time in the UK, we had the Mental Health Act. We didn't have another procedure for people who didn't fit the Mental Health Act. So DoLS, I just want to really remind us, is rooted in the Human Rights Act, and it's rooted in Article 5, as it's an Article 5 procedure. I think if you are interested, if you weren't around at the time, or if you want to refresh yourself, you can actually still find this information, the test case, on BBC Radio 4, if you follow that link. So way back in time, way back now in what feels like, you know, a very different landscape, a very different time, lots of issues around how someone was deprived of liberty, whether they were in fact. And as a result of that, DoLS, the scheme, was introduced in 2009. But I'm sure anyone who was around in DoLS at that time can remember it was a very slow start. Those of us in DoLS teams, I managed a DoLS team at the time, we were literally gathered around the fax machine, waiting for one to come out the other end with great excitement so we could go off and do this new thing called DoLS that we'd all been trained to do as best interest assessors, and we were raring to go, but it was an extremely slow start. Sadly, I suppose, in many cases, that slow start didn't continue. So if you just look at the graph there, I mean, I could have filled in all the years in between, but it's pretty stark, isn't it? It speaks volumes. And if you just look at the difference between 2013 and 2023, 13,000 to 130,000 applications. I don't think you see that kind of data really anywhere else. And without being too radical, dare I say that the funding pretty much is still based on the figures that we had in the beginning, around that 2009 time. You'll have seen from the impact assessment carried out for LPS that there was suggested figures of what it would cost to fully fund DoLS. But as yet, those figures haven't turned into anything financial. But just look at those figures, huge numbers, 332,000 applications last year. This is huge. So what was it like in the early days? Well, really, up till 2014, it was quite a confusing picture. We had case law regularly changing. 1 minute there was a case, and then we go, oh yeah, we have to do this now, and oh, that's changed, now we have to do this. And care homes would ring regularly and say, you know, Lorraine, is this the DoLS? And I'd say, well, it wasn't last week, but maybe it is now. You know, case law changed the way we interpreted the meaning of a deprivation of liberty. The guidance in the Code of Practice was not hugely helpful. It gave indicators, but it didn't give anything clear enough with a clear definition. Do we refer or not refer? That was the eternal question really for direct care providers right up until 2014. So as everyone knows, and I'm not going to repeat here, eventually 3 cases got to the Supreme Court where we finally got some definitive deliberation on the meaning of deprivation of liberty. You will also remember that during LPS and the passage of that, there was a lot of debate about how to get a definition in that Act, and that didn't really prove to be successful. So 3 cases, all of the 3 cases were found to be deprived of liberty. There were 2 sisters and a young man. None of them, interestingly, were living in care home or hospital. One was in an NHS facility, one in a foster placement, and one in supported living. But fundamentally, the most important sentence, I think, is that the court said people with disabilities, both mental and physical, have the same human rights as the rest of the human race. We're briefly going to look at that question in the time we've got and ask ourselves, do they? Do we still see that? And Lady Hale famously said, a gilded cage is still a cage. No matter how lovely the care arrangements are, how empowering, how enabling, a gilded cage is still a cage. And so we got from that Supreme Court judgment the acid test of a person being subject to complete or continuous supervision, complete or continuous control, and not free to leave. That means they are deprived of liberty. We also got at the same time, or just slightly earlier, House of Lords post-legislative scrutiny of the Mental Capacity Act, which suggested that despite the government's intention to close the Bournemouth gap, DoLS were not being used as frequently as they should. That was then. That the criticism of DoLS, including from the judiciary, demonstrates, they said, that it is not fit for purpose. We're still having to use it, of course, but this was the view of the House of Lords. So they recommended a comprehensive review of the DoLS legislation with a view to replacing it with something that was compatible with the style and ethos of the Mental Capacity Act. So we know that that led to the period of the development of LPS. So what we got was the all of the planning, the Law Commission work, the royal assent for the changes to the Mental Capacity Act, which would introduce LPS. We had consultation on the changes, which I'm sure everyone here was involved in. What a fantastic time. I mean, I personally have spent about 3 years working on this. And we had consultation between March and July 2022. Even as I wrote that, I kind of shocked myself. I thought, so that's 2 and a bit years. What happened next? Absolutely nothing. And that's the kind of scary bit. That's where we find ourselves now. We know that the government did say there was no intention to bring forward LPS in the life of that Parliament, the Parliament that has just gone. So we find ourselves not even having had the response, government response to the consultation published. And I'm sure you all spent a long time on that consultation. I know that I did. We also find ourselves in a position where we don't really have a code of practice for either DoLS or MCA because both are out of date. And we don't know when or even if LPS will be implemented. So doom and gloom, Lorraine, move on. Where does that leave us? So it leaves us kind of, to some extent, crying for help. This is what I feel I kind of do every day, really, and say, okay, I don't think that lifeboat's coming. What are we going to do to ensure that we practice in the best possible way in the time we find ourselves? So it's fundamentally, I think, about asking always this question: what did it mean to have the same human rights as the rest of the human race? And I think that's key to us improving practice both in MCA and DoLS. Legal literacy, really very important. Robust legal literacy. What's the basis on which we make our decisions? Good MCA practice, less restrictive practice, good care planning, and a wide understanding of human rights, especially at Article 8 and Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. To some extent, I've always described DoLS as a flea on the back of a dog. DoLS is a really, really tiny bit, a little schedule in this huge, overarching, and what I still believe is brilliant legislation. The MCA has got two aims: empowerment and protection. We need to continue to fully understand it and understand what that means, being familiar with what Section 5 and Section 6 allow and don't allow, understanding what the MCA means by restraint, and understanding when a restriction becomes restraint, becomes a deprivation. So important that we have this good understanding of the Human Rights Act, a good overview to help frame our practice, remembering that DoLS is purely Article 5, liberty and security of person. It doesn't allow us to restrict those things that are covered by Article 8, private and family life. How we promote rights and autonomy, working towards that sense of equal recognition before the law, and always aiming for a situation where people with disabilities have the same human rights as the rest of the human race. So we navigate this current landscape with robust mental capacity assessments. Keep your training up to date. Most importantly, understand how to apply that training in practice. What do the 5 guiding principles look like? Sound best interest decisions, recognising the person's will and preference. Good understanding of the principle of less restrictive practice. Making changes to care plans to promote rights and reduce restrictions. And I'm sure more will be said in the next 2 webinars, but trying to stay on the right side of the restriction, restraint, deprivation continuum. What I mean by that is general care and treatment. There is a defence for our action in Section 5 of the MCA. If we reasonably believe the person lacks capacity, it's in their best interest to do something, we're able to do that. Sometimes that involves restrictions. We're moving through this continuum. Sometimes it involves restraint. Restraint itself still sits under the MCA in general, with the protection coming in Section 6, provided the thing that we are doing is necessary to prevent harm to the person and proportionate to the likelihood and severity of harm. If we go beyond that restraint, then we are into deprivation of liberty. We need to rely on the deprivation of liberty safeguards, or in fact, community DoL applications. Same principles apply. The route for authorisation is slightly different. So it's really important that we spend our time understanding when we're on one side of that continuum and when we're on the other. What can we safely deliver by reliance on the Mental Capacity Act? When do we cross that line to deprivation of liberty, where we need then either to make a court application if we're outside hospital or care home, or 16 to 18, or we use the deprivation of liberty safeguards if the person is in a care home or a hospital. So it's a really important question. Maybe there'll be more about this in the next 2 webinars. So why not come along to those sessions? Section 2 focuses on Session 2, not Section 2, focuses on avoiding a deprivation of liberty, and Session 3 on practical ways to help the DoLS process overall. And just a last slide where I recommend to you a little film about deprivation of liberty in all kinds of settings, mainly community, but also residential. And I promote that because my daughter's artwork is the basis of the film. So I'm quite proud of that. So I think at that point, I have exactly used my 15 minutes and I'll stop sharing. And then I think there may be time for questions.
That was great. Thank you so much, Lorraine. You did a fantastic job at covering so much in 15 minutes. Perhaps just before we bring on Clive, we do have a little bit of time for a couple of questions. Just one reflection. I kind of think I sort of know that stuff that you've just spoken about, Lorraine, but the way you present it is always thought-provoking and helpful, certainly for me. And it made me reflect on, although one can't put the clock back, a little bit like when sort of pre-2014, when the number of applications was much smaller, the evidence showed that people thought really hard about those kinds of issues, about how do we support the person to make a decision? What's restraint? What's restriction? What might be a deprivation? How can we use good care practice, good person-centered care to avoid that deprivation? And then post 2014, it's become a bit of a sausage factory, hasn't it? Around do we DoLS them, to use that terrible phrase, which now removes that kind of reflection about good practice around the Mental Capacity Act and human rights, which you've so well covered. If by all means answer that, but I also want to go to Liz to ask Liz if we've got any particular questions that have come up whilst Lorraine was speaking that we want to pose to her just in the next minute or so. Anything, Liz?
Not specifically for Lorraine. There's a request around the link to the test case, which will go, I think, in the resources that get sent out. But I got a question. It was a very useful reflection, actually, Lorraine. And as you say, we've kind of lived it, haven't we? But seeing it set out in that timeline, I think, is really key. And so in some conversations with providers about kind of how they look at metrics and numbers and indicators of how well they're delivering their care services, the issue of DoLS always comes up. And of course, since 2014, which you showed so graphically on your graph, often the reaction is, well, there's such a long delay in getting any sort of response from our local authority because they're overwhelmed in this particular policy space. It's quite hard to kind of understand what you might measure around success. And I thought that was an interesting question, because perhaps success is actually reducing the number of DoLS applications we make. But I wanted to get your take on it while we're thinking about it specifically.
I absolutely agree. And it's one of the things I've always put to DHSC. We don't know whether a lot of DoLS applications is good or whether it's bad. You know, we've got people measuring things left, right and centre, but is it good to make a lot of applications, or is it not good? You know, and I don't think we've ever actually sat down and looked at that, to be entirely honest. You know, yes, of course, make applications where appropriate, even though we can't often look at them in local authorities. It's better that they're in and it's safer for the care home and the person. But I think we have, just picking up also on what Toby said, to some extent thrown out the baby with the bathwater, because we've forgotten about trying to reduce restrictions. It's kind of so all encompassing, this complete and continuous supervision, control and not free to leave, that I think people have just kind of given up, and everything feels like it's a deprivation of liberty. But I've been doing quite a bit of training just in this last couple of weeks on restriction and restraint, and going back to that MCA definition of restraint, you know, to restrict a person's liberty of movement, whether they resist or not, you know, and looking at how actually in some cases we can move it back down that continuum. You know, the key point is that people are protected. the people we work for and deliver services to, and ourselves. So it's about that kind of legal understanding that says, make sure, you know, that your building blocks are in place, whichever side of that continuum you fall. But I think we've got to remind ourselves that we can reduce restrictions and we can have less restrictive practice if we try, and it is still really, really worth trying.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think sometimes, as you said, the sausage machine that did you say that, Toby? The sausage machine mentality can take us over, and we're so used to things around safeguardings, for example, that we over report things almost, don't we? Because we don't want to be seen to be trying to not report something. But then sometimes, as you say, we perhaps haven't been able to give it the time and space to think about, in a particular service environment, what might the options be. So it's a very timely reminder for us, I think.
And I think that's also a reminder that the second webinar on the 5th, the 7th of October, 7th of November, sorry, is about, it will involve Lorraine as well, who's going to be talking about how one can reduce the need in good care practice for the use of deprivations of liberty or restraints and restrictions. So again, please do come along to that. And just before we bring in Clive for his presentation, just one reflection. It just seems so ironic that the new government has announced that they're going to reform the Mental Health Act in accordance with work that was done over the last few years around that. And I believe them at any one time there's around 25 to 30,000 people detained under the Mental Health Act, I think in England and Wales. Yet we've got over 300,000 applications for DoLS, a system that is kind of really under strain, massively under strain. In fact, I'm married to a BIA assessor, so I know from their point of view what it's like. And yet no indication of any work that's going to be done around that or the code of practice and so on. So
and you've got 40,000 people died last year waiting. For an authorization, and 130,000 on a waiting list. It's a human rights crisis, but you don't get the feeling that anyone's particularly listening.
No. Well, perhaps it's time for another Making Decisions Alliance type campaign.
Well, I was going to say, maybe it's tight. I mean, the Mental Health Act provisions that, I mean, we've not seen the bill, but you know, the work that was done, actually there may be an opportunity there to think about what we do actually want, you know. Also, Lorraine, a lot of love in the Q&A for being able to see your YouTube video. Just want to say that. So the gang have been popping the chat in. We'll all go and have a look at it now, I think. Thank you.
Great.
On that note, I'm going to move us along, I think, and bring in Clive Parry, who is our next speaker. So Clive is the Chief Executive of ARC England, which is a membership organisation for providers of services to people with learning disabilities and autism. And Clive is not going to use any slides, which is always refreshing, and is going to speak about the perspective on DoLS in the context of Mental Capacity Act and the things we've heard about from Lorraine from the point of view of people with learning disabilities and autism, families and people who support them. So over to you, Clive. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. And excuse me, fantastic walkthrough from Lorraine there of the history of DoLS, and fantastic slides. When I saw those, I made the decision that I wasn't going to be able to compete with those. So as Toby has said, I did make the decision to go ahead without slides today. Quick few words about myself and the organisation. ARC is the Association for Real Change. We're a membership body that supports about 100 providers that provide services to adults with a learning disability and autistic people. So before we get into the conversation about the perspective of people with learning disability, I wondered if it'd be useful just to say a few words, sort of more general words about DoLS and the Liberty Protection Safeguards. I guess they both had the same aim, the same essential aim, which was that they were designed to protect the human rights of people who lack capacity to consent to the arrangements for their safety and well-being. They also both set out clear ways that people can challenge a care plan. They make all of us, including commissioners, relatives and care staff, look for the least restrictive ways that we can work with people in person-sensitive ways. LPS differed from DoLS in the sense that they were designed to be simpler and easier to understand than DoLS, and to fit within the empowering framework of the Mental Capacity Act, which they're part of. There were supposed to be fewer hurdles in the process, so there's no form to fill in to make a referral, and the DoLS timescales were dropped as part of the LPS plans. So from the perspective of most care staff, the changes, the day-to-day changes wouldn't have been great, but support staff in a care home or supported living settings would have had to get to grips for the first time with systems that care homes had previously learned to live with since 2009. The other thing with LPS is it would have brought in people aged 16 and over and people living in community settings that were not part of DoLS. So I just wanted to say those few words about DoLS and LPS because it just is maybe helpful to colleagues. So like all good care for people who lack mental capacity for some decisions, LPS also put the person at the heart of the process. And that means that the wishes and feelings, likes, dislikes of the person were central to planning how to care for them. LPS would have brought a clearer duty to listen to what the person's family or friends were telling you about them, so that their care plan fits their personality. And most importantly, in DoLS or LPS, we must always try to make any necessary restrictions on an individual's freedom as light as possible. And to do this, we have to recognise their individuality. Obviously, we've said at the beginning of the webinar, we don't see any indication from the government that there are any plans to implement LPS. So managers do need to check to see if, whilst we were waiting for LPS, we stopped delivering MCA DoLS training. And I think that's going to be, for me, a central theme for my part of the webinar. We are seeing that ourselves through the work we do with our members, that whilst we were waiting for the LPS process to come through and to come to fruition, in many cases we paused the staff training that would have otherwise taken place around MCA and DoLS. So we think it's important to, in provider settings, to talk about MCA DoLS with managers and talk about their most recent training, making sure that the training courses that they've attended are up to date. And it may be that you're looking for trainer-trainer courses at this stage that can disseminate training throughout the organisation. I think Lorraine mentioned that there's the other big issue for us is that the promised revised MCA code of practice that would have accompanied the implementation of LPS is obviously nowhere on the horizon. So we are dependent on the analysts of case studies to help us to understand how to work with issues such as fluctuating capacity and executive dysfunction. So this is sort of building a little bit on what Lorraine said about the initial early stages of DoLS, where there was a real serious reliance on case law until we got to the Supreme Court judgment. We still have quite a lot of reliance on case law, particularly with things like fluctuating capacity and executive dysfunction, which are concepts that weren't necessarily part of DoLS initially. So thinking about the indefinite postponement of LPS, I'm thinking about it from a provider perspective first. We need to, as I say, to make sure that staff and managers, MCA and DoLS training is up to date. If we've got staff that have not been properly and recently trained, it's possible that we'll fail to identify that a person is being deprived of their liberty and we won't seek an authorization. That, from a provider perspective, makes the deprivation unlawful, and obviously there are a lot of risks that go with that. We think there are also risks around providers and supervisory bodies losing touch with the DoLS authorization processes, and that might mean staff are working together but they don't really understand the processes, they're not familiar with the processes, and perhaps have lost some of the working relationships that are necessary as part of those authorization processes. One of the things that can lead to potentially is that authorization requests can be even less effective and even slower than they have been. And it's easy to see how providers could fall into bad habits, including in relation to assumptions that they think they know what's best for a person and is in the person's best interests. So I guess what we're talking about here is that the training isn't just about knowledge and understanding and competence. It is also about reiterating and reminding us about least restrictive practice and making sure that we're thinking carefully about what genuinely is in that person's best interests and not assuming that we know that. We think that inspectors, CQC inspectors, local authority quality assurance teams, we think that from our own knowledge, from our own training, one of the issues that comes up for us quite frequently is around provider records, particularly around capacity assessments. So when we're talking about MCA and DoLS training, it's very often about what it is that we're recording to demonstrate our thinking as we made the decision whether the person has capacity or lacks capacity. And if there's a single part of the inspection process or the quality assurance process around MCA recording that comes up most frequently, it's around that. And I guess what we're saying there is that what we see very often is that the provider mental capacity assessments don't detail the ways in which the person assessing capacity supported the individual with their communication needs, for example. They don't show how we worked in a way that would help maximize the person's capacity. And they don't show necessarily the detail of how we reached the conclusion. And that is, for us as an organization that offers MCA and DoLS training, that's probably one of the most common things to come up in a provider setting. Thinking about, again, in a provider setting, we also now are seeing increasingly AI solutions being developed that might not take into consideration the impact of those solutions on supported people. And those uses of AI may well constitute restrictions within the meaning of the MCA. I just want to give a quick example of that. We heard about an organization that was allegedly at the forefront of implementing AI solutions. In this particular case, they were supporting people, some of whom were able to leave the building independently, but some were not. And they developed an AI system where they had a camera and that closed and allowed the door to open or close. If an individual came up to the door to go out and wanted to leave the building, the camera would identify through facial recognition who that person was. It would then look up that person's care plan and consult the care plan to determine whether or not the individual is allowed to leave the building. And if the care plan says that they're not, then the door doesn't open. If that person approaches the door accompanied by a support worker, the door will open. And if another person who has a care record, a care plan that says they can go out of the building independently, approaches the camera, the door will open. One of the concerns we have around that model is that how have we explained that to the people who are being supported? Have we helped them to understand how that system works, or are we actually potentially making life more confusing? And in the context of MCA and DoLS, is that a restriction that we're placing on individuals and falling within the meaning of the MCA? Thinking about supported people and people who could be being deprived of their liberty or living with restrictions that have not been authorised, there are obvious risks around that, around whether or not that deprivation is lawful, as I said earlier, and around whether those restrictions are necessary. If we're having fewer conversations with supported people about DoLS, we could fall into accepting that the decisions the provider takes are always paramount and that the person has no rights or fewer rights to challenge these. So here we should recognise that people with learning disabilities and autistic people who are being provided support by service providers, we work with a range of people with a range of different abilities. Some folk will have quite complex support needs. There'll be folk who don't use words to communicate, and there'll be others who are living reasonably independently. When we lose the conversations about deprivations of liberty, and when we lose the conversations about best interest decision making and mental capacity, we're losing something there that's not just from the provider side and the staff side, it's also the conversation that the person would be a part of. And we're worried there that could mean that people become less inclined to speak up for their rights or less likely to recognise that they have rights. So in conclusion, I think the primary concern from the perspective of people with a learning disability and their families, and from the perspective of providers who support people with learning disability and autistic people, it's about, for us, making sure we revisit the principles of the MCA and we revisit the training that we used to run and that perhaps has been paused whilst we're waiting for LPS to come through. So I think that's probably it for me, Toby. I think I've said all I intended to say. If we wanted to offer folk a chance to ask a few questions, happy to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Clive. That was great. And that emphasis you gave about the ongoing need for staff and people supporting people with learning disabilities and people with autism, and also obviously other people who may lack capacity around training, that the training isn't just about DoLS, it's about DoLS in the context of the Mental Capacity Act, and as we heard from Lorraine, about taking into account human rights legislation as well, but always to go back to those 5 principles in a way of the Mental Capacity Act about how can we help a person to make the decision, what is in their best interest, and so on. Could I ask you a question, Clive? And that's fascinating, the example you gave about AI, which I hadn't come across before. And I guess it's in some respects a development on the use of CCTV. And in the example you gave, were you aware, were those people under DoLS, or were they not under DoLS? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that, Toby. This came up at a recent webinar that I attended, which where this system was being discussed as part of a package of solutions that the provider had developed. I think I don't know enough about the organisation, and I'm not a member of ARC. But I think the main point for us that came up was the excitement that we have rushing towards grasping the AI solutions might lead us to overlook the questions that we want to ask about how that might place restrictions on people. So what I picked up from the webinar was that this, and I understand why, the provider was thrilled with what they developed. They thought it was really clever, and it undoubtedly is really, really clever. The point I wanted to make is that we talk very often about AI, and we'll often preface what we say with, well, this of course must be viewed through the lens of the supported person. We must always think about this in terms of the impact on the supported person. We also hear if this frees up time, then we must use that time for more relational interactions with people, and not simply replace people with machines. We say those things, we don't necessarily do them, and I think that was really my point. And I don't think this provider had necessarily thought that through and asked the question, where does this fit in terms of deprivation of liberty? Where does it fit in terms of restrictive practice? But also, given the person's support needs, how does this tool work in terms of them understanding their life and where they live? If I'm that individual, I'm probably going to spend quite a lot of time near that door trying to work out what it is that makes that door open, because it isn't me, but it is him or her. And that's part of the challenge for me, is developing those solutions that we haven't necessarily properly thought it through from the supported person's point of view.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it actually came up in the questions, some of the questions that were sent in advance of this webinar about use of CCTV, and I guess the same would apply in the example you gave about whether that constitutes continuous supervision and control. So maybe that's something we can come back to at the end of this session, when we bring Lorraine back in and Caroline to talk about that. But I remember when I was working more at the Mental Health Foundation, and attending a number of conferences before, when we had lots of face-to-face conferences pre-COVID, how there'd often be very enthusiastic IT developers turn up with great solutions, often involving lots of monitoring and camera devices, about how you can look after your loved one. And when the question was posed about, have you developed these with people with lived experience of dementia and thought about some of the legal implications, they looked rather blank, hadn't really thought it through. I'm not going to castigate all IT developers and web developers for that kind of enthusiasm, but I think there is that trend to see AI as a solution to everything, to some extent.
I'd say, Toby, that I think really the point we're making here is that with what's happened with the development of LPS, that's then obviously been indefinitely postponed, is what's the impact of that in terms of us taking our eye off the ball, really, in terms of mental capacity and in terms of DoLS, and talking about that stuff creates the culture within which we think about people through the lens of MCA and DoLS. And what have we maybe potentially lost there as we were waiting for the LPS to come to conclusion? That's really where we're most concerned, I think.
Yeah. I'm not going to ask Liz to bring in any questions at this point, because I want to give Caroline her 15 minutes of fame. So thanks again, Clive, but it may be that questions will come back to you when we have the session after Caroline has spoken. So I'm now going to introduce Caroline Baker, who is the Head of Dementia and Quality Assurance at Belong Limited, which is a provider of services to older people, particularly people with dementia, in residential care settings and other settings. So straight over to you. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Toby. I just need to share my screen. Just bear with me 1 second. Can we just confirm that we can see that? Okay. So, hi, I'm Caroline Baker, as Toby said, Head of Dementia and Quality Assurance at Belong, and I've worked with the organisation for the past 2 years. It's a not-for-profit organisation, but I've worked in dementia care for more years than I care to mention. And interestingly, I remember when DoLS was first introduced, and it seemed, well, it was at the time, that it needed to be people that made an active expression that they wanted to leave, be that through going to the door by saying they wanted to leave. So it's interesting how everything's really evolved over the last number of years. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Belong, because it's always a delight to tell people about our villages. So we've got 8 care villages. We don't normally have llamas on reception, but I just love this picture of that was taken at one of our villages. So each village is a real community and accommodates up to 72 people within small households. Now, these households accommodate people with varying diagnoses, so we don't have specialist dementia care facilities as such. Each of the households provides specialist dementia care. So there's a maximum of 12 people where people can participate in preparing their own meals, can help to carry out the housework if they want to, but it builds a real connection because it's a smaller number of people, continuous staff within the household environment. Within the village, there's also up to 20 independent living apartments, and people can live on their own or they can live with their partner and access all of the facilities within the village. We have a bistro that's very yummy in every village, and this hasn't been good for my health. But this can be accessed by the community as well, and it's a great place for people to meet their relatives and for people to come off the household if they fancy a change. And then we've got a venue, which is a licensed facility, which is quite a large room, and that's where we host a lot of our community activities along with general parties, etc. And then we've got a hairdressers, which is kitted out with all the up-to-date equipment, and most of them have nail bars as well. And then a gym, which is really actively used in every single village that we go into. So we also offer experience days for people, and this is for people that are currently living at home but want to just come and spend 1 or 2 days with us, generally a week. And obviously while they're there, they have a meal with us, join in with the activities, and access activities in the venue, go to the bistro. They might want to go and have their hair done, but they work really, really well. We've had some really positive evaluations. And then we've got a Belong at Home service for every village, where we go out to people living in the community, but also to our tenants living within the apartments if they request that. And I must say, Belong at Home have had some exceptional awards since they've been going over the last few years. And then if you look at the picture on the right, we've got our integrated nursery in our latest village in Chester, which has just been phenomenal. It really has. The interactions between the children and the residents and the tenants has just been out of this world. We've had visitors nationally and internationally, and you've probably seen snippets on the news and the one show we've been on, because the impact's just been out of this world. Now, at Belong, I just need to give you a heads up that I had to familiarise myself with some different terminology when I first started. So if I say anything that you're unclear of, then please give me a holler at the end and ask me what I was talking about. But it's all about that different thinking to help to move us really away from a traditional nursing model of care, because our nurses within the village operate on a district nurse type model, where they go to see the nursing residents within the village, but support workers will generally administer medication. Obviously, they've been trained to do so, but all of the people's medication is within their own room. So it really is a community feel. Okay, so getting on to the bit that you probably want to know about. So I just want to talk to you about somebody that lived with us for quite a few months. We'll call him Tom. Obviously, his name wasn't Tom. But he previously lived at home with his partner, and they continued to care for him, although the marriage had been annulled. But things became a little bit strained at home, and possibly because they weren't married any longer, they perhaps felt that they didn't want to carry on delivering the care. But Tom was considered to be quite a wealthy man, which normally wouldn't be significant, but in the context of this case study, really formed part of the discussions that we were having in relation to some of the elements that came up. But the partner had also informed us that relationships had broken down with Tom's family and that he no longer had any contact with them. We didn't know the full ins and outs of this. We were just told that that was the case. And so Tom was quite insular in many respects. And when he first came to us, he really was quite withdrawn. So he was reluctant to engage with other residents and staff. And I remember every time I met him initially, he looked at the floor. He found it really difficult to maintain eye contact. He responded in monosyllabic conversation. And it really was quite difficult to get to know Tom as a person. He did have a diagnosis of dementia, but Tom really wasn't accepting of this. And I think that may have led to his depression, or the fact that he'd moved out of home. It wasn't quite clear at the start. But on occasions, he became quite distressed and he'd shout at other residents and staff. But again, was this because it was a transitional period, because he'd not long moved into the village and was sort of trying to adjust? It may have been because he led quite an isolated life with his partner back at home, and perhaps all of this wanting him to get involved in things was just a bit too much. So initially he was assessed as lacking capacity. Consent to reside at Belong and deprivation of liberty was applied for and approved, and initially there were no conditions attached to that. So one evening Tom became incredibly distressed, really distressed, and a decision was made with Tom's partner to provide one-to-one support, because at that stage we felt that we'd looked into everything we could possibly look at to help reduce Tom's distress. But given that he was still becoming distressed, we thought if there was a companion with him one-to-one that could try and engage in stuff that he just liked to do for himself, and that one-to-one connection might help him rather than being with everybody. So that was put in place, and Tom started to have regular walks outdoors with his companion. Then we had a slight panic. We received a call at the village that Tom had jumped off a wall and hurt himself. And given his recent depression, we were really quite concerned. Had this been planned? Was he trying to end his life? So myself and the Admiral nurse, who were in the village at the time, went off, and it was nearly a mile and a half, I seem to recall, sort of walking and running to try and get to him. But when we got there, police were there as well, which sort of heightened our anxiety. But it just happened that they were passing. But it transpired that he'd just tried to jump off a 1-foot wall. He was trying to navigate his way around an obstacle, and it grazed his knee. And I remember him looking at us absolutely nonplussed and wondering what all the fuss was about. So that was a good ending to that part of the story. But Tom also began having regular exercise sessions with the exercise specialist in the gym. And he really would use the equipment with vigour, to the point where the exercise specialist had to try and encourage him to slow down on occasions and not to do as much, because he just enjoyed it that much, and it seemed to really increase his well-being. But he also went on regular walks with the exercise specialist almost daily, who took along the dog as well. And this enabled Tom to form a real bond with the exercise specialist and the dog. And Tom became more social with everybody, became more interactional with staff and other residents, and he started to become more sociable generally, and he'd start to join in with the activities within the venue and the bistro. So it was fantastic to see this gradual improvement in his well-being. And then one of the support workers, with Tom's permission, because he'd started to open up more and be much more talkative, managed to trace a member of family that Tom had previously lost touch with. They were delighted to be contacted and wanted to re-establish the former connection. Gradually visits ensued at the start, and telephone calls, and this became much more regular. But Tom, initially, he did become quite distressed. He appeared a little bit confused. He started to question the relationship. He started to ask us if we thought he was doing the right thing. And so then we became concerned, because given the fact that Tom was considered to be quite wealthy as well, obviously we got to make sure that there weren't any ulterior motives to this reconnection. So as the village spoke with the local safeguarding team, and safeguards were put in place for at a distance observation. So, for example, the member of staff would sit in the bistro at one end of the bistro and just quietly observe Tom and his family member. But Tom wasn't to go out with his family member at that time, because they were saying they wanted to remove him, and they were being a bit angsty at the time, and a bit confrontational. So it all became a bit, well, quite complex, to be honest. So we weren't sure from Tom whether this was what he wanted at the time. But then as things settled down, Tom began to become less confused and distressed, and sort of reverted back to where he was before he was reconnected to the family member. And he made it clear to us that he wanted to go and live with the family member. To cut a very long story short, we carried out another MCA and deemed him to have capacity in relation to this particular decision. So the village made contact with Safeguard and DoLS to help Tom to proceed with his request. So as I say, it was a really complex situation, and the amount of documentation we've got in relation to this, I could literally do a 3 or 4 hour session. So to go into the minutiae is quite difficult, but I just want to give you this overview. Ultimately, everybody was acting in Tom's best interest and wanted to make sure that it was the right decision for him and that he had capacity to make that decision. And I think there were lots of questions at the time as to, well, we said that he didn't have capacity at the start, but now we're saying he's got capacity, but he's got dementia. But also we needed to take into account that he was quite clearly depressed when he came into the village. So lots of hurdles were to be overcome, but the staff at the village were really tenacious, in particular the Admiral nurse, because she'd built up a really good relationship with Tom and knew that this is what he really wanted. So we refer to section 21A of the Deprivation of Liberty, and this asks us if the person you represent is objecting to their care arrangements, you have an obligation to support them to exercise their rights of review. So this is where things got really, really quite complex, because there was legal representation from the local authority. They had their solicitor. Belong had their own solicitor, who was also obviously representing Andrew's best interests. The family then engaged a solicitor, and there were lots and lots of meetings to review and discuss the best interests for Tom. And all the meetings centred around balancing risk, changing the documentation as we went along to look at the different conditions, keeping Tom and his family member up to date, because Tom understandably was getting quite frustrated with the process because it did take 2 to 3 months, because he just wanted to go and live his best life, and it just seemed that all these blocks were in place to stop him from moving on. But Tom did get home. He went home after several months of moving in with us, and it was lovely that a couple of weeks later the family member sent us a picture of Tom at home, and he just looked so happy and relaxed within his new environment. But I thought that it was a really interesting case study, but I liked this picture that I've put on the slide because for me it took a lot of courage as well from the staff. Well, from all parties involved, really, because I think once a DoLS has been implemented, particularly perhaps for people living with dementia, people are quite nervous about then removing that and saying that people can go home. Because what if it goes wrong? What if we've made the wrong decision? What if some harm comes to Tom? So I think, it's just a really great case study to show that people can be liberated once again. And that's the end of my slideshow. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Caroline. Obviously, I should have said at the beginning that you're going to give that perspective on DoLS from the experience of a person with dementia and Belong supporting them. And when I saw your slideshow when you sent it to me earlier, I remember being surprised at the end. I mean, it's a surprise ending, as you say. It's not.
Yeah.
It takes courage and very careful thought. And really, one of the things I jotted down was really knowing the person. And ensuring that everyone knows a person and what their wishes and feelings, values and beliefs and values are, as best interest requirements say, to make that decision. So it's a really positive story in that respect. So thank you for sharing it with us. So we've come to the end of our presentations. Thank you, Caroline, for that. Just before you go, Caroline, Liz, were there any specific questions that came up for Caroline while she was speaking, or should we just go straight to the more general questions?
Well, there's a question from Amrita who says, you mentioned carers administered medication, interested in whether you've had to put the meds in a place the client had no access to, as they might overdose and take medication throughout the day, but the carer was informed where to find them. So an aspect of an aspect of potential protection for somebody, but also potentially overprotection, I guess.
So there are cabinets within the person's own room, within their wardrobe, that is lockable. And if the person's assessed has been able to take their own medication, then obviously they have the key, but it still needs to be locked in case there's other residents within the village that might access that cupboard. But yes, the support workers are all trained to give medication and obviously deemed competent before they do that. But it does mean that there's no traditional ward drains and trolleys going around the building, and it works very much as if the person was living in their own home.
I think we've all got a slight horror of the meds trolley.
Yeah.
There are some other questions. So the interesting reflections on the AI example. That's quite.
I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, I'm quite fascinated by that.
Perhaps I could ask Lorraine and Clive to bring themselves back onto the screen, so that and Liz, you stay on as well as Caroline. So is that So we've got all three speakers, myself and Liz. One question I did notice that actually someone had asked prior to the event, and there were several likes, were about DoLS in community settings. They didn't sort of specify it anymore. Obviously, as you were saying, Lorraine, the Supreme Court case involved some people with learning disabilities in supported housing settings. So I don't know whether, at the moment, the law, as I understand it, you still have to simply go to the court of protection if someone is living outside residential care or hospital setting, and there may be a deprivation of liberty. But I don't know whether you or Clive perhaps have anything else you want to reflect around DoLS in those community settings.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to get together some data, the core whole data, but as we've looked at it, doesn't seem to resonate with our experience. So different places are doing things differently. There isn't always one clear team that you can refer to. Sometimes it's the DoLS team, sometimes it's the community team, because it sits with either the local authority or the ICB who are funding the care. Generally, with a community DoL, if everything is pretty straightforward, you can use what's called, hopefully, the REX procedure. So it's just a streamlined procedure where it's decided on papers, but not if this is a 16 or 17-year-old. They will always be full hearings because of the complexities around being in care, representation, and so on. So there are set forms, the forms have recently just been updated. The forms are all on the court protection website, and it's the principles are exactly as you would all be familiar with for DoLS, really. But the route to make that legitimate is slightly different, slightly more complex, and it's one of the downsides of LPS really not coming in, that it would have rolled that all together in a much more straightforward way. Not hugely a fan of all of LPS, but that bit, yeah, it would have been easier.
Yeah. Clive, do you have anything you want to reflect around? I don't know whether your training, DoLS and MCA training, cover situations where people might be deprived of their liberty in sort of community settings or supported housing settings.
Yeah, thank you, Toby. Yeah, it does. The training does cover that, and we obviously support providers that support people in through domiciliary services. So, and as Lorraine said, I think Lorraine has explained it better than I could. But the principles have to be the same, don't they? That we have to approach these things like best interest decision making and mental capacity assessments in exactly the same way. I guess that was one of the things that potentially LPS would have done is bring that, as you say, Lorraine, into the scope. And made that more straightforward and probably better for the court of protection in many ways, but probably would have opened the scope to include a lot of people that currently are not included potentially. So that brings us back to that question of resource, doesn't it? And I'm fairly certain that resources around LPS will certainly have been part of the conversations that led to the decision not to progress with it, because we're not really resourcing what we're doing properly, as Lorraine very clearly showed in her slides. So nothing further to add to that, really, Toby.
And I think had it LPS come in and it be applied to community settings, I can hear screaming Daily Mail headlines about intrusions into people's family life, which obviously is Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights about the right to privacy and family life. So it could have helped resolve some situations, but I can imagine it would have blown up with a lot of publicity around other situations, I suspect. Liz, are there other questions that you want to throw in? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I'm
go
just
ahead.
smiling at the irony of a Daily Mail headline on European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah.
So Marie's asking a question related to the community DoLS point. Says, if an individual has community DoLS through the Court of Protection but goes into residential care for respite, can the conditions be used for this setting, or is a new DoLS needed?
Respite has been a thorny issue, I think, from the start of DoLS, and there's two ways to look at it. So some people, if a person has regular respite at predictable times, so maybe they've got the dates for respite throughout a year, you can have a DoLS authorization for those dates, and the rest will be a community DoL. My own view, and it is purely my own view, is that if you're going to the court for a care package to be approved, you may as well try and include the periods of respite within that court application. Because the sort of nature of the restrictions and so on are probably very similar, but there isn't, sadly, a definitive answer. I think it's one of many things that nobody thought would happen with DoLS. DoLS has that focus just on permanent care home and a hospital. So if people are confused, it's right to be confused, because we all are. I don't know if that's reassuring, but we all are a little bit.
Oh, that's helpful.
Thanks, Lorraine.
And we've still got Amrita. Amrita is still asking about medication. So going back to the she's interested in your view. She says, thank you, Clive, for your contributions in the Q&A. Going back to medication and the locked cupboard, is it required to apply for a DoLS in this scenario if the client is deemed not to be safe around their medication? Wants Caroline's perspective as well as Clive's.
But I just quickly say that would that take us back to the acid test, then, Rita, though? I don't know if that's where you would be headed with that, Lorraine, but that would be where I would start.
Mhm.
Yeah, if that was the only restriction in place for someone, that the only thing they couldn't do was access medication for absolutely best interest reasons, that wouldn't of itself amount to a deprivation of liberty, but it would be a restriction at best. But it's unlikely that somebody would only have that restriction in place if they're not safe around their own medication. Maybe there are other restrictions, so when we add them all together, we find we've got ourselves complete and continuous supervision. But if that was it, then of itself it wouldn't be a deprivation of liberty in my view.
And in
I would
a
add,
traditional, sorry.
sorry, I was going to say that I'd add to that, if it didn't amount to a deprivation, we would expect to see that care planned in, and that means with the commissioner.
And I think in a traditional care home model, most of the medications are locked in a medication trolley that people can't have access to. So it is, as you say, Lorraine, Clive, it's very individual. But if people are receiving 24-hour care, then often medication is part of their 24-hour care.
Quick question for you, Clive. 16, 17-year-olds training to support people who support 16, 17-year-olds. Is that in your repertoire?
Not specifically, but just can you just say a little bit more? I can't see the question there.
The question says, please can I ask for a signposting to who you'd recommend for any specific training available for children and the 16 and 17-year-olds we support specifically?
Right, in that case, no. Our training is primarily aimed at providers and staff working in settings that are supporting adults.
I have put an answer to that in the chat, but I'm not sure if my answer's gone in the right place. So it's just a link to one of the barristers. People may know Neil Allen does deliver training on his website. I mean, I'm not paid to promote Neil Allen's training, but it's just someone
taking a cut.
I don't get a percentage, no. but I just happen to know that he does cover children, young people, adolescents, and things like that, and his training's always very good. So I've put the link to his website there, I hope.
I've noticed, Liz, there's quite a question about DoLS for people with severe dementia when they're admitted to hospital. Have you seen that one, or are we going to come to?
Yeah, that was coming to that one next. Our biggest bugbear around DoLS is when someone's admitted to hospital, even for a very short period, and then the hospital apply for a DoLS, which then means we have to reapply when they get back, even though they've only been gone for a few days, and it seems like such a waste of time. Why really?
I feel your pain 100%, and I share everything that you've just said. There is a facility within DoLS to suspend an authorisation. That facility only exists for a Mental Health Act admission, because whoever wrote this stuff in the beginning only ever imagined that somebody would have a mental health admission. Now that, in my experience of DoLS over many years, rarely happens. A person with dementia in a care home rarely then gets detained under the Mental Health Act. How lovely it would be if we could suspend the authorisation because they've gone from a care home to an acute hospital. I've just had an email exchange about this only in the last week, because as you say, if the hospital apply for a DoLS, that automatically ends your one. And then that means that you have to apply again when they come back. And believe me, from the local authority side, that's 3. applications. We've just had the existing one, the hospital, and the new one. We don't want it either. Sometimes we can kind of just take a bit of a risk, but it is a risk. If the hospital don't get round to applying for a DoL, we may just hang on to that existing DoL, and before we know it, the person's back with you and everything carries on. We can't do that if the hospital apply, it automatically ends it. There is absolutely no way around it other than just saying everything's the same as it was the last time that I made this application. And the work I'm doing in the West Midlands is to try and make the forms and the processes as easy and simple as I possibly can. And this is kind of one of the areas that we've been looking at, because it is just a pain. I won't go any further with that sentence because I think it's being recorded.
Madness. Maybe we could lobby for some simple changes, even if we're not going to get wholesale. I wonder.
Yeah, we've tried.
Do
So
we have
then-
other questions, Liz? I couldn't see any.
Yeah, well, Heather
Or-
makes an observation. With respect
Right.
to reducing the need for more DoLS applications, it's a challenge to make these decisions. Governing authorities, overseeing bodies always lead with asking if a DoLS is in place whenever something goes wrong. It's true that maybe it's become a sausage machine, but care homes get held to account well, yeah, okay. So everyone does ask probably after the event of something. As a
We've probably-
registered, oh, sorry, let me just have a look at this one.
Probably just got time for one more question if there's something.
Yeah, well, just back to the hospital debate. As a registered nurse, when I worked on the wards, we were told we need to complete specific capacity MCA and follow with DoLS. So the hospital's telling everybody to do DoLS. The local authority's praying that the hospital doesn't do a DoLS, and the care home's praying that the hospital doesn't do an application so that their original DoL stands. Great.
Yeah, exactly. And the number of acute hospital DoLS that the number of requests in the country compared to the numbers that are actually granted is unbelievably small. The hospital's right to put them in, but we can never get to see the person because they get discharged before we see them. So it has to go through a whole bureaucratic process, and the authorization's almost never granted. I've got the data on this. It's a whole thing in itself. Another thing that irritates me greatly, that I wish we could find a simple solution for.
Toby, am I allowed one more?
Go on. What quick one then?
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you. If someone has post-traumatic amnesia and is gradually regaining capacity, should a DoL be applied for immediately, or if the restrictions are gradually being withdrawn as the person recovers, can the decision wait to apply for the DoL?
Okay, I'm jumping in to answer these things, so please tell me to be quiet. The thing with the DoLS is it's permissive. It's not mandatory. So you can have a DoLS in place because the person needs it at that point in time. As they improve, you don't need to restrict them. If they no longer need those restrictions, you don't need to apply them. And ultimately, there can be a review and the DoLS can be brought to an end. So I would say, because it depends how long this thing is going to take for the person to regain capacity, I would say go for the DoLS, but be aware that you don't need to restrict someone. That's your decision. You originate the restrictions and the care plan.
Can I just add to that when we're making an assessment of the person's capacity, it's decision specific, which and taken at a moment in time. So it's difficult to make a decision about somebody's capacity as we think it will be in the future. That's not how a capacity assessment would work. As I say, it's taken at a moment in time, and it's about a particular decision.
Thanks, Clive. Thanks, Lorraine. I can see you nodding, Caroline. Was there anything else you wanted to add just before we wrap up? You're on mute at the moment.
No, I just it's been really helpful for me to listen to all perspectives, actually, and thank you to the other speakers and for your chairing, Toby and Liz.
Thanks, Caroline. It is 25 past now, so I'm going to just wrap up the session. So I just want to say, obviously, thank you everyone for joining today's event. I found it really interesting and useful. I think in particular, two or three points that I jotted down on reflection was, Clive's points about the development of AI and how we consider that and how that gets used in the context of deprivations of liberty. I think is really important to consider. Lorraine's point about legal literacy is absolutely essential, and it's not just about understanding the DoLS process, but it's understanding it within the Mental Capacity Act, within human rights legislation, but not seeing those things as something to be scared of. Whilst the DoLS process is complicated and bureaucratic, I've always maintained the belief, and I suspect our speakers would agree, hope they would agree with me, the Mental Capacity Act is designed to empower, not to restrict. It does have safeguards in it, but it's designed to empower, as indeed is things like United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So they're there in a way to help people, to support people with disabilities, not in some way to restrict them. So that legal literacy is not only important, but it improves good practice through the training that Clive mentioned. Then you can maintain and develop that legal literacy, and it should be in the context, as Caroline was saying, of understanding the person, who they are, good person centre practice, but also sort of family centre practice or relationship centre practice. It's not just about the individual, but understanding them in the context of their personal relationships. So it's been a great session. We're going to send you a feedback form. A link will be sent to you via email straight after the webinar finishes, or within 2 or 3 minutes. So we'd really appreciate it if you could complete that. I think it's very quick to do. As I say, and a write-up and further resources, as well as the slides, will be posted on the Care Provider Alliance's website. But remember, the website won't be available this weekend. And just one final reminder that the next webinar in this series is on Thursday, the 7th of November. As I say, we're planning that as a even more interactive workshop style session through having a panel of speakers who will speak for relatively short periods of time. We have speakers from Belong and ARC England, as well as IMCAs, Independent Mental Capacity Advocates, coming along, and the benefits of Lorraine as well. And that session on the 7th of November will be really focusing in on what providers can do to perhaps reduce the need or avoid or prevent a deprivation of liberty taking place, something that Lorraine alluded to very clearly in her presentation. So thinking about what is good care practice. It will be at the same time as today's session, 2 p.m. until 3:30. You can sign up via Eventbrite. You can post questions for the panel. Some of the questions that you've posted in advance of this webinar we'll be certainly using at that webinar and the final one in December. So thank you for those. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Liz, just before we finished? Any final point from you? There you are.
Just to say a huge thank you to our presenters. Really appreciate your time and the time and effort you've gone into getting ready for the session and coming along today. Thank you to our participants, audience. Really great to get your questions. And I guess make sure you sign up for the next one and keep them coming. Thank you.
Great.
And thanks to you, Toby.
That's all
Expert
right.
sharing.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, I'd want to extend my thanks to Lorraine, Clive and Caroline for 3 excellent, well-timed and really pertinent presentations